All right, well, welcome back, everyone. They've already started the wrap-up without us over here. So thanks, everyone, for being with us. Thanks to everyone online who's been watching this. It's been so great to have this really, I think, energizing and productive conversation today. For the wrap-up, we were trying to figure out, what we might contribute to the conversation that we've already had. And so the idea that several of us on this stage alighted on was thinking about bringing together some digital practitioners with connections to Philadelphia institutions, past and present, to really maybe reflect on some of the themes that have emerged from this conference. As you're going to see in my introductions, the people sitting on this stage represent different types of institutions engaged in doing open data work. They're from universities and libraries, both public institutions and private institutions, and they're also at different stages of their career. So, I'm hoping a little bit of this conversation can be thinking about what this conference might have looked like 10 years ago, 5 years ago, but also what this conference might look like 10 years from now. So I'm going to introduce folks. I guess I'll do it in the order that they're sitting there. On the end is Bayern L Miller, Head of Digital Scholarship and Technology and Project Co-Manager on a number of APS grants. He spends his days running the Center for Digital Scholarship and making sure that library patrons can access the diverse array of collections held at the APS. Sitting next to Bayard is Sophie Ziegler, Head of Digital Programs and Services at LSU Libraries, where they manage the Louisiana Digital Library, which we heard about earlier today. Now, also announced by Sophie earlier, but I'm going to repeat, prior to 2018, Sophie was the Head of Digital Scholarship here at the American Philosophical Society. Then we have Bethany Farrell, don't go to sleep on me, is an art historian and digital humanist. That's my computer, not you guys. You're like, wake up, Bethany. Bethany Farrell is an art historian and a digital humanist with a PhD from Temple University. I think we discovered earlier today that Bethany has been at the APS 3 weeks longer than I have and has written 15,000 more lines of open data than I have in her time here. Bethany is with us right now, is an NEH digitization technician working to digitize large collections for our Revolutionary City, a Portal to the Nation's Founding grant. And then immediately next to me is Peter Logan, Emeritus Professor of English at Temple University and the past academic director of the Loretta C. Duckworth Scholars Studio there. He specializes in 19th century British literature and history and has published extensively on problems in 19th century British culture. So we've got a great representation of Philadelphia here. I thought, we'll keep this conversation to about 35, 40 minutes. I thought we might use the conference title, Reuse, Redistribution, and Risk, as a way maybe of orienting. Really excited just to hear some of the things that have struck you in this conference. And this is not this panel, this stage telling everyone out online and in the audience what they think. This is meant to be a conversation. So what I'd like to do is, I'll ask a sort of thematic question, but then I want folks please to raise your hand if you have comments and questions that you want to add to it. But maybe we could just start with the sort of history question. I'd ask each of our discussants if they might just want to say a few words about what open data has looked like for them, what their experience of open data has been, either in their own personal research or in their institutional roles. And it is that sort of question, are we in the same place with what we're talking about when we talk about open data here in 2022 that we might have when you first started your careers or first started your current positions? Bethany, do you want to start us off? I'll throw you in.
Yeah, so I was thinking about this, and I started in digital humanities. The impetus was to discover new and make new inquiries into my research for my doctorate, and I was trained in it. And there was this kind of philosophy that I kind of continued, which was to be jealous of this data I was creating, to keep it private, to not share it, because it was my intellectual property and I needed to be careful with it, and that's how I was trained. But at the same time that I was creating this and I was finishing up my dissertation, I was starting to kind of have a bit of a crisis about what does it mean to be an academic? Like, is it just to publish your own research, or what's the whole point of this whole thing? And I just happened to work with Peter on his project, and then work at APS on the Franklin Ledgers project and on open data projects, and really kind of found a renewed purpose in what's the point. That for me, I always talk about open data as an act of generosity, that you are being generous when you as an academic are creating open data and then making sure that it's disseminated. And so I think what it did was kind of, maybe not, like, I think it's a little too much to say it saved my career, but gave me a lot more sense of a purpose to what I wanted to do as an academic, which was starting to really flounder at the end, as it often does, at the end of writing my dissertation and wrapping up. So I think that that's, what it really means. It's actually very personal to me, that the importance of open data and us kind of pushing this out is that, it's a personal act of academic generosity.
Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, so when we started it, well, you started it. So Sophie's my predecessor, started the Open Data Initiative here at the APS, and it started small with the Eastern State stuff. It was just you and I think Michelle Ziogas, correct? Just transcribing these data sets, putting out there, thinking what to do with them, and that was that. And since that time, we now have had, I was calculating earlier today, over 20 people come through the APS and work with our Open Data Initiative, put out 3 pretty big projects, and I think it's up to like 16 data sets that are publicly available. So it's sort of just grown each year. With each project, it gets bigger and bigger. We started it, we didn't know what we were doing, and we still kind of don't know what we're doing all the time. I think that's what I got out of this conference is a lot of our projects are similar, and we're all doing them sort of in different ways because there is no book or manual for how to do open data, so we sort of just figure it out as we go. And with each project at the APS, I think we get better and better. As we progressed, and I took over the center, Cynthia Hyder, who was here earlier today, and I started thinking about, okay, well, how can we make sure we document all the choices we're making about the data, being completely transparent. Came up with a system of, how we can append our documentation to the data sets so that when folks download the data sets, they know everything we've done to the data, the silences that we've created in the data, the choices we've made to apply gender where gender didn't exist in the data set, reasons why we did that stuff. And we keep moving forward with that. Now we're at a stage where, we're evolving our projects. Our Franklin Ledgers project started as a postal project. These postal books that you may have heard, I think it was yesterday, Bob mentioned it, that they were deemed unworthy of historical inquiry. And we said, no, they're not. So we created the data sets, put them out there, played around with them, visualized them. But then Bethany came on and we evolved the project to include all the ledgers and all the shop books. And now we're in a place, working with David Nelson, who's in the audience tonight, put out a database that we've created a way to search through all of Franklin's ledgers that we have, because we created a system of IDs. So all that to say is it just keeps evolving over time. And our next big challenge is sort of this question of interoperability. So we've got this big meteorological weather records project that we're working on. We've got all this weather data sort of trapped in these journals, but we're working with our partners at the Center for Digital Editing in Virginia and the Jefferson Papers at Princeton to create a federated portal. But we've got to come up with a way to make really ugly, messy data sets speak to one another, because every 18th century person who created these data sets did it completely differently. So yeah. Good?
Very good.
Hello, everybody. Let's see. So I like the question of what's different. I'm so glad that Pat Spiro is in the audience today. Pat, I don't know if you remember when you and I first started talking about doing open data at the APS. It was hard to explain at the time, right? So it's come a long way. I don't imagine a conference like this could have happened 10 years ago. We had to explain why we would do it, because it's a lot of resources, and explain who would get a benefit out of it. And we had to counter arguments against it. That included things like, what if you get the transcription wrong? What if you put out bad data? Which continue to be very important. But it's interesting that the assumptions have shifted fundamentally. And we don't really question whether or not we should be doing it at all. We might question aspects of it. So we had a lot of back and forth, you and I, Pat. And I think very, very early on, one of the reasons why it took root the way it did, especially at the library side of things, and this, to my thinking, this project can't be overstated. So the emergence of the, I think at the time IMLS funded Collections as Data project, and we have Stuart Varner here in the audience also, who's been a part of that since the beginning, if I'm not mistaken, has really convinced, I think, a lot of librarians, museum professionals, and archivists that open data from collections held in our repositories can be useful to researchers. And I'll just say one more. So I think we started it here, and then Collections as Data started, which really influenced our work here, because now we had a national conversation at the library level, at librarianship level, I should say. And then, so it really started to take root. But there's another thing that I think, another development that's really, really important, and has been reflected, if I'm not mistaken, without fail in every single panel here today. And that's just the ethical concerns that come up, right? And we all call it something slightly different, perhaps. But we all recognize, and I don't think we would have 10 years ago. I think, Bob Hauser, when you were introducing everything last night, when you paused to point out that the gentlemen behind us were all slave owners, I don't think that would have happened at the APS 10 years ago. I don't think the race consciousness, I don't think our thinking about historical events or anything like they were. Like, we wouldn't have been able to assume that type of thing. And we can all speculate on the major societal shifts that have happened. But I think even if this conference did happen 10 years ago, even if we did find enough people who were doing data in cultural heritage fields, in humanities, I don't think we would have seen the same sort of ethical emphasis, the same sort of care about the harm that our own professions do, and our emphasis on not spreading that further. So I feel like a lot has happened since we started.
Thank you.
Well, certainly a lot has changed since I began my career. We got an internet, for one thing. But seriously, I agree with everything that was said. I would like to just add a little bit to it. I think structurally a lot has changed that's made open data not just more feasible, but actually required, and specifically grant funders in the humanities and social sciences, and I'm not sure about the sciences or not, and maybe Amanda or Katrina can answer that, but grant funders have been requiring publicly funded projects to publish their data and make it available online, openly, and that's had a huge impact on what has actually happened in terms of the growth of open data. We also have the rise of institutional repositories in universities for faculty research, which encourage but don't require that it be published openly, but it has made it much easier for people to publish their data sets openly. And I think that's driven by the rise of grant funding requirements for their own faculty, but there's also other large scholarly repositories that can hold large data dumps and make the data available. I'm thinking in the humanities and social sciences, the biggest one is CORE, and that's a large open access not-for-profit organization. So there's no proprietary aspect to this, which makes it much more usable. And they change the possibility for sustaining project data. They won't, for example, sustain the interface, the front end, but they will sustain the data that you generated during the course of the project so that other people can reuse it and make it available broadly for a considerably long period of time. So yeah, a great deal has changed, and I tend to think a lot of it is institutional and pushed institutionally, mostly by the grant funders.
Yeah, I think that's, and I wonder, to build off your comment, Peter, I think the increasing divorce of the interface from the data set, which is not something that we were necessarily doing 10 years ago, is a result of the maturation of projects as they get older, and the fact that we are losing the sort of first generation of projects. And at the APS, we have a large portfolio of digital projects, all of which are still largely preserved in the original sort of interface that they appeared on, but some of them are getting old, and there are questions that Bayard and his team have to wrestle with. And so what does that mean? And, there's part of us who want to think about the interface itself, and if we're losing something in that, but the core of the data seems to be the place where we agree has to be saved for nothing else, for no other reason. So one theme of this conference is reuse, and I want to thank Amanda and Katrina for their paper, who gave us some really wonderful definitions of reuse, which was really helpful as I was reading up for the conference. And so if we think about reuse as the use of a data set for a new purpose, as Amanda and Katrina's paper tell us, and many examples show, this might be done to reproduce or replicate research. I don't know if that's if we see that as much in the humanities as we might in the sciences, but definitely worth thinking about, to ask novel questions, or to serve as comparisons or models through the combination with other types of data. And I think, Bayard, you were gesturing towards that with the meteorological data that also initially comes in various data forms in the 18th century, but that also, we've all seen data sets where people have used different categories and we try to get them to talk with each other. So as you sit here, having heard for almost 24 hours some great ideas and some great papers, what sort of modes of data reuse or trends in data reuse are really exciting for you? And this is, of course, for the folks on the stage, but also for out there. What are the things that you're going to leave this conference being really excited about and wanting to think more about?
I'll just make one quick shout out to Robert Lee's project, which is a perfect example of how you can reuse data by combining it with other data to create something entirely new. And I think he's done an extraordinary job of that. So yeah, I'm very excited about that, but also incredibly excited about uses we haven't thought of. Once it's open, it's open. It's gonna be there. And hopefully other people will do things with it we could never even imagine. I hope.
Yeah, I guess I got two comments. The unintended or uses, like you said, there was two good examples on the redlining project, and it wasn't intended, or you didn't intend for it to be used by scientists and medical folks, and that's the people who are using it the most. Is fascinating. I think it was in Amanda and Katrina's your survey. I don't remember exactly, but it was an indigenous data project, I think, and the person who was questioned went into it thinking there was going to be a big conversation about native place names and how problematic they are, but really they got in the conversation, and all the people wanted from the data was to talk about native land rights and whatnot. So that's really interesting. We see it in our meteorological records. We're doing this because we want them to be out there. We want climate scientists to be able to use them, historians of climate. So I didn't even really think about any other potential uses for that. But then we had two fellows come and work with us and use the same data, the Madison records, and to tell two completely different stories. Molly Nebbiolo, who we heard from today, used it to trace the transatlantic seed trade, using Madison's notes of what fruits and vegetables arrive at his plate for dinner, and just all the plants that he would document in his detailed notes. And then another one of our fellows, Joe McCook, used it to discuss labor conditions for the enslaved on Madison's plantation by just talking about the weather conditions that they would be working in there, and the foodways there. So just interesting stuff.
Yeah, I think that answering novel questions is really, it seems like it's the exciting thing for us to be talking about. And I agree, when I was creating the data set for the Franklin Ledgers for his shop books, it was exciting to think that we can talk about anyone but Benjamin by looking at these ledgers. Like that you can, a number of different scholars can use this data if it's structured properly, if it's, if it's created in a way that people can get information out. And I thought that was, for me, it's really exciting to think that someone who's interested in women in business in the 18th century can actually really use those ledgers in an effective way. And it's nice to hear that, I think I was struck, and you were as well, with the scientists interested in the redlining project because of, in like lead and issues like that. That's great, and I think that's what makes it exciting, is for this kind of novel questions.
Can I just add that Bethany's got an forthcoming chapter, which she's going to retitle, possibly, "It's Not All About the Benjamins," baby.
I see you going with the question. Let me just say real fast. I tend to think about reuse from the institutional side. So this came up a little bit in my presentation, but I really didn't dwell on it. And then I know Brian Carpenter, your question was really helpful about reuse during the panel that I was on. But I like to think of it, from the institutional side. And y'all, I don't know if you spend a lot of time on digital libraries, but use statements are sometimes just sort of all over. Deriva, I'm looking at you. I know you know this. And it's just sort of crazy. So much of the term copy fraud has been thrown around. So really helping everybody sort of clean up, being able to communicate what can be used, how it can be used, and adopting standardized rate statements, whether that be Creative Commons or writestatements.org statements, or whatever is appropriate for your field, is really the type of thing that I spend a lot of time on, and whenever it happens, it just makes me so happy. My little heart, y'all, just fantastic.
I think one of the things that gets really, so Sophie's talking about the institutional side. I'm thinking about the new audiences that might reuse this. So a question I would have for Bobby for the American Doomsday Project is the landmark Supreme Court case, McGirt versus Oklahoma. Our indigenous community is going to be coming to that project, realizing the power that provides them in justifying their claims to fraudulent land deals and steals. Is there the possibility that this becomes a tool of reparative justice? Is that level of reuse, is that going to move beyond the people in this room, but move into communities that might not have known that these resources were there for them to use? Other ideas, exciting forms of reuse? All right, well, it's not a quiz, so you can keep thinking about it. Another theme of the panel, of course, is redistribution. Thinking about the redistribution, the recirculation of data strikes me maybe as an appropriate point to think about the ethics involved in doing this work, but it also might be a point to think about the labor involved in doing this work. And I feel like actually digital labor has not been talked about maybe as much in this panel as we certainly see it on social media conversations. I wonder if you might think a little bit about the sort of the ethics of labor that are involved in doing this work, if we are in a better place in 2022, or if we have a long way to go, or any sort of other thoughts that come, or other ethical considerations that you want to sort of to throw into this conversation.
I don't know. As far as labor goes, yeah, it is like everybody who makes data knows there's a lot of just sitting there typing. It's really hard. And it takes forever. It is like a labor of love, I guess, because you want to get it done. But I don't know whether we're better off or worse off. I know here we like to give everybody credit, and we publish everything with the Magazine of Early American Data Sets. So it is like a line that people can use. And in all our digital projects, we give credit where credit's due, I guess. I could name all the 20 people who worked on open data projects if you want me to, but yeah.
But you've published them someplace else. Yeah.
What?
But you have published them someplace else. They can.
That's right.
Well, one of the things I always think about in terms of the labor of these projects is, and I don't think it's changed enough yet, is the use by faculty members of their own students to generate data, whether it be having them transcribe something as part of the course or anything else. I know Miriam has published some really excellent guidelines on this that has gone into the ethics of it. And I just wish more people had actually read them, because is it ethical to ask your students to do this? Even if you have a kind of a vague rationale as to how there's some pedagogical benefit to them copying down something that was written 200 years ago, and you're going to do something else with it when they're done, it's highly questionable, deeply questionable, and I think those are important questions that faculty certainly have to ask themselves before imagining that they can use students as a free source of labor. And in the same way, crowdsourcing is another place where too many people think of crowdsourcing as simply a form of free labor. Well, that'd be great. You put it out there and all these people are going to give you their labor for free. But that's just a complete myth, of course. At least I've recently, I'm still involved actually in an NEH Institute that's training people how to do crowdsourcing. I've learned a great deal from it, creating a site for Zooniverse. And the first thing they tell you is that the volunteers who are helping to crowdsource this have to get something out of it. That's the key point. It has to be meaningful to them, not you and what you're going to do with the data. You have to actually make it a useful experience for the user, for them to want to continue to participate and for it to actually even be ethical in the first place. So that's very different than thinking about crowdsourcing as a form of cheap labor. It's crowdsourcing as a way in which non-academics can be involved in a research project and can learn something in the process. So that's more like crowdsourcing as education than as free labor.
Mm-hmm.
I think an add to that, we heard a lot today about stakeholders and collaborators, and I think, I only know this through the APS, but I think we're in a better place with this, where, all of our projects, we have stakeholders and we make sure that everybody has buy-in and everybody's voices are heard. I know with our Rev City project, we had a great year where we had, 16 stakeholders, they were all paid, and we just had these great projects, this great conversations, and our project's like way better for it. So I think whether it's interns that come through or fellows that come through, I like to make them know, because it's true that like this is their project too, and I want them to get something out of it in the end, and I really mean that. So, but I don't know the field as a whole.
So hearing you pose those two questions one after the other, one about redistribution and one about reuse, makes me wonder what your definition, and not just your individual, but what our definition of redistribution is, right? Why is redistribution not reuse? And how much work has to go into redistributing something? How much modification has to be there before it is considered reuse?
It sounds like you have the answer. And I would like to hear it.
So for me, right, almost any redistribution is reuse in itself. And the very fact that you are taking something and releasing it, that is an act of reuse, right? So that's kind of challenging to say how much work one has to do. One has to do some amount of work. The key problem that one runs into very quickly is one of attribution. And at what point has one added value to something? And then how do you go about connecting the older artifact to the newer artifact? And at what point is the thing that you have created worthy of being its own thing, right? And at what point is it just some trivial modification of the old one? And I think that is where the real rub is. And then again, YMMV kind of thing, right? But that's where I come down on it.
That's great. I think Lynn and Holly, do you have questions?
I was just going to make a quick comment that I was just going to make a quick comment in regard to the last question about credit and making it worthwhile. And one of the things we've been thinking a lot about with my group is that maybe the humanities need to be a lot more like the sciences in terms of thinking about credit allocation, in terms of authorship, in terms of giving credit for all the work that's done in transcribing and introducing and annotating and making sure there's a way to find out who does it and that they could put it on their CV and that people could know they were involved in this work. So they can get meaning from it in the sense that it means something to them too, and in terms of choosing to be a transcriber or to take a class. But giving that credit too is, I think, something that's under theorized in the humanities. We have this still an old-fashioned vision of often sort of, lead researcher, a single scholar. And one of the things about the digital humanities, it seems to me, on almost all the projects we've talked about, is that they're actually better they're usually group collaborations, and they're better that way. And we should be thinking more like the sciences.
Yeah, thanks. Just a quick follow-up to continue a theme here about credit. On the first sort of point about students and so forth, maybe I feel a little guilty because I run a class where it's really advertised that students for the final project will contribute to stolen relations. And actually, students sign up precisely because of that. They're like, I write so many papers and then no one reads them, but this is something I can contribute to that's durable, and they get course credit for it. So I don't know, I guess maybe I should feel bad, but I don't at the moment, and I hope that's not wrong, because I see them as collaborators. They are on the website. They get credit for the contributions. I would have also asked about the other side of this, which is credit from the institutional perspective about the work we do. And maybe this is a thornier question, and if my deans are listening out there, hi. But honestly, this is a point of frustration I imagine we all feel, those of us that are in positions where we're trying to sort of make certain benchmarks, which is to say, I'm doing two things simultaneously. I'm writing a book, and I'm also working on this project. Only one of them will get me to the rank of full professor. And that's really challenging and problematic. But the one that is not recognized is the more meaningful work for me at the moment. And I don't really know how to reconcile that.
I guess I'm going to follow up on that. I didn't know if anybody wanted to respond, but I have a comment and a question. And the comment, Sophie, thanks for the shout out to go down memory lane a little bit more. All I remember is coming to the APS, and one of the three things I wanted to do was create a DH lab, and I didn't know how I was going to do it. And then I learned about you and your work, and I just ran into you in the hall one day, and I said, I think I'm thinking about a DH lab, and you said, yeah, let's do that. And from there, we're off. So I don't think the APS could have done any better for getting it off the ground and then training your successor, who's done an amazing job, I think we all have seen. But when I came here, I thought about a DH lab, Digital Humanities Lab. People have been talking about the humanities. We still are really rooted in the humanities. And the thing that I've been wondering about just in this afternoon is what if this room was filled half with social scientists, what they would say about what we've been talking about. Would they think we're being naive, that we're rediscovering the wheel? Like, what would social scientists who have been rooted in data like this for a long time say about all of our conversations? And the other is building on that legitimacy question, which is the one that I really wanted to ask everybody, and I'd love you could respond to the question is, how do we all feel collectively about the legitimacy of this project, of DH, of digital scholarship? Because I remember when my DH project was a corollary to the book that was going to get me tenure, and the DH was just a nice side thing to show off that people actually engaged with more. They found that more interesting than the book, but only one really counted. And has legitimacy changed? There's been so much that has changed, but all the centers, most of the centers at universities are rooted in the libraries, which I think is telling. It's not necessarily a bad thing, but it is a library project that faculty might be affiliated with, but usually only after they got tenure. So how do we feel about the legitimacy of this project within a larger academic community?
I mean, Patrick, not much has changed. I mean, I defended last year, and there was really no way for me to do anything to show my other than static images of my visualizations. And, there wasn't necessarily institutional support in that way. Now, I got institutional support to create those projects through the Duckworth Scholars Studio, and I'm very grateful because the discoveries that I made through that project were integrated into my dissertation. And so I was constantly pointing out, this data that I created, informed this argument. But it wasn't like there was a way to host this information. And I would have been a little leery, to be perfectly blunt, in allowing Temple to host that information. And it's not a criticism of Temple, it's a criticism of all universities and the way they own and possess dissertations, and where I possess, what knowledge I possess and what they possess and things like that. So unfortunately, I mean, I'm not aging you, Patrick, but things haven't changed, and even when I started working in DH, this was one of the first questions that they started asking us, and it was in 2013, 20, something like that, and they were pointing out that this is a problem, and when I went to defend in 2021, it was still the same problem. So that's kind of a bummer of an answer, but it's just the reality.
So I'll take you further back than that. In 2006, I was at a promotion and tenure panel at Texas A&M University, where I was still a graduate student. I was a computer science student, so the issue of digital humanities was not a make or break for me. One of the things that a newly hired assistant professor asked our provost or dean of faculty, I think she was at the time, was exactly this. You hired me to do digital projects. I do digital projects, and where is the credit in that? And the answer from Karen Watson was, you don't, okay? And someday you will be sitting in my chair, and then you can give the credit to whoever you want to give credit to. It was brutal, but I don't think the situation has changed very much today. And I hope that, again, I am not in the humanities in the same sense that the faculty here are today, but I think you guys will be those people sitting in those chairs one day. I hope you are. And I hope you make different decisions than the faculty or the deans of today are making. The hope is you guys. Don't look elsewhere, because you are those people.
I feel like I don't want to kill that vibe. I would add that the institution I was at before coming to the APS has one of the nation's oldest and most esteemed public history programs and one of the nation's oldest digital humanities centers. For me to go up to full, I could only do it in a monograph. And that is, in fact, in some ways, academic faculty have become more entrenched in the monograph, especially as it becomes harder to publish a monograph. Risk. So, but I don't want to, in some ways though, and maybe, Sophie, if you want to say some things about the sort of library side, is the library the promised land for DH work? Because I think we might be a little naive to assume that the library, the university library structure, the independent research library has gotten it all right, and that the university has gotten it wrong.
Could you raise your hand in here if you're a librarian? I love those of you who are kind of librarians. Thank you. Because I'd love to hear your thoughts about that. So I work in an academic library. I'm going up for tenure. I do a lot of digital things. I have direct reports in my department who are tenure track, who do even more digital things. And so I have to make the case that their GitHub repos should count. Their code as it's picked up by a community project should count. And I think some of my colleagues at my library may be watching this now or a recording of it. And so I do want to give credit that there is a lot of talk that should be applied. But I am, I think, the first group, headlining the first group in which it will actually be tested. Fingers crossed. Well wishes appreciated. We shall see. But what I don't think is that libraries have it figured out for a number of reasons. And one of the main ones, I think, is that there's always going to be a legitimacy problem. For those of us who are librarians and faculty, and always want to prove to the university that if we give someone tenure, it's because they're super great. To then turn around and say, actually, the super great work is all on a server, is actually kind of a complicated place to be. So I do want to sort of work with that, but I would love to hear from other librarians, sort of how you think about it. Because Pat, I think you're right. A lot of digital scholarship on campuses do go through the libraries. It's not always the case, of course. And in my library, we don't actually have a functioning digital humanities support structured up and running currently. But do any other librarians want to speak to your work and how it's recognized? Bayard, I think your work is well recognized in your repository. I just want to say. But I'm just sort of curious if anybody else is feeling.
Adriana, can we scramble the signal for a little bit in case any
Yeah,
supervisors are?
Oh, that's right.
I can pause the broadcast.
Yeah.
If you want, I will.
Oh, maybe we'll talk afterwards at the bar.
All right.
Maybe y'all don't want to say it. How naive of me. I'm always over talking, so double fingers crossed for me.
Well, I realize we are standing between all of us and the bar. I did want to get to the last theme because I think it's a really important one. It's the question of risk. So what are the greatest risks facing open data right now? Oh, Bob. Bob, what are the greatest risks facing open data right now?
The greatest risk is giving me the floor. Because I want to take us back a minute to Patrick's question, which I took as kind of a subtle attack or prompt or something, and he said, "Are you folks reinventing the wheel?" And so I'm going to do what that congressman from Massachusetts once did and answer a question with a question, which is to say, to what extent do you folks, and I don't mean just those on the panel, but everybody who's been involved in this enterprise, take advantage of the existing data libraries, main data libraries that have been around in the social sciences for years. The Inter-University Consortium for Political and Social Research at the University of Michigan, which has been around since 1962. The huge operation now run under the name IPUMS, IPUMS, at the University of Minnesota. And there are many others internationally, major data repositories where folks also really know a lot about the management and creation and documentation of data, metadata, and so forth. And the other question is, to what extent are some of the aspects of historiography that I've heard discussed here akin to ethnography, to those kinds of methods, to taking what should I say, phantom data that are difficult to code, data that are difficult to understand, textual matters that have to be contextualized. To what extent has that been used as a resource? Thank you.
Fantastic question. I think, so from my point of view, I don't use those repositories for their holdings, but I do use the papers that the people who run those write greatly influence the digital librarianship that a lot of us do. It influences the open source projects and the architecture that we build. So from that, yes, absolutely.
Ryan?
I just have an add-on comment on the question of like credit and labor and things like that. I mean, a lot of, yes, DH work comes out of university settings, libraries, and faculty, and there's a lot of DH works that comes out of other institutional settings, government archives, private institutions, many different shapes and sizes. And there are many, I've heard from other archivists and librarians who may be in settings where they're kind of in a mixed situation, like that on the one hand, they're not under pressure to have to get tenure or something, to have to produce things, and to have to deal with this question of this thing that I really like doesn't get credit, but this other thing I'm required to do. And so on the other hand, they don't have that pressure. But on that side, they don't have pressure to do that. On the other hand, those positions are often structured where there's no way, they can either do the work or promote the work. They can't do both. So there's a lot of situations, especially in the sort of the baseline work that precedes being able to create a DH project, where it's maybe fulfilling, but there's really like, they'll say like, I've heard people say like, I'm able to write about it now, but I'm not able to do it anymore. And some people may be perfectly satisfied with that and choose to do one or the other, but it's a conundrum for this other set of kinds of positions in the broader like universe of DH work, I'd say. And if anyone has any thoughts on that, I'd welcome that.
I think, I don't know. Well, I don't know if this is answering your question at all. We used to build projects, put a lot of time into them, and then put them out there, and then move on to the next project, as you know. But in recent years, we stopped doing that, right? And it's a lot. Kyle came, we started we're new division, library museum programming. So now every project that we have, we spend a lot of time with it, and then we just started doing this. We think about how we're going to roll it out, and this rolls into something that came out of a lot of projects today, or talks today, is the question of audience, right? So I think this ties together, because it does kind of, it's not fun to spend all this time on a project, put it out, and then just have to move on to the next thing, and then not promote it, and then nobody uses it, nobody knows that it's there. So I think that's where we're starting to get here, and I think it's good. There is a balance, right, between work, because we have the regular archives, libraries work to do, but we also have these projects. So yeah.
So by way of wrap up, in 5 years from now, when we host the next Open Data Conference at the APS, we plan really far ahead here. What are the greatest risks of right now that we'll probably be talking about in 5 years? Or if you don't have a great risk that you're leaving, are there topics that we haven't talked about today that really will be something that we have to talk about the next go round?
I'm going to get this out of the way because it's somewhat of a bummer. Sustainability is still going to be the primary question, because it was the question 20 years ago, more than that, like it's been the question since the beginning. Like, how do you sustain these projects? And that's on so many different facets. It's, Sophie, you were talking, and I loved this about like when someone who's leading a project leaves, who's picking up the project to keep it moving at an institution? And by moving, I mean just like not breaking too. Or if you're choosing to use a certain program, a certain database, how do you make sure that it still exists in 10 years? And so unfortunately, like, I think it's because it's so difficult to address, and it's kind of the boring aspect of DH and open data. It's not well funded, the question of at least in my opinion. And so sustainability is what we're going to be talking about again in 5 years, which I'm kind of sad about, but it's just being honest. And hopefully we'll be talking about other things, but I still think that someone's going to be saying, talking about the elephant in the room again, and so that's my way to end this.
I'm going to jump in because mine's a bummer too. I think in 5 years, especially if we do this in 10 years, one of the things that I will be thinking about is how many cultural heritage institutions we have lost and their data is gone. Their materials gone, right? I'm coming again, I spend my time in southern Louisiana. We are one hurricane away from losing anything and everything. We are losing a significant amount of ground. This didn't come up in my presentation, but one of the things that my team and I do is a mobile digitization lab where we're trying to target the more at-risk institutions and find a way to work with them if they're willing. But that's going to be the case. We know that our digital preservation is exacerbating climate change. And we know that our historical records are increasingly at risk. So I can't imagine we're going to make it through this same conference in 5 years without talking about that.
Who has something fun? Yeah, fun things.
I got something a little optimistic, maybe about sustainability. I think it's just, and it's like impossible to find time to do things, but documentation is key. What happens if you have an open data project that's on a server that gets wiped out and you don't have documentation to rebuild it? You got to figure it out from scratch, right? But if you document as you go with your projects and then store all the data files and basically leave it in a place that someone could come and pick it up and rebuild it from scratch. I know it seems impossible, and when you're working on a project, you have so much other things to do, and thinking about that along the way isn't fun, but I think that's where we're going to try to go here at the APS, and I really like documentation. So,
yeah, well, I certainly have to agree with that, but in a way, this is where the issue of separating the front end from the data set itself becomes really important, because the data is the thing that's irreplaceable. The front end could always be rebuilt and probably rebuilt better, but if you lose the data, then you really are done. And so finding ways to actually preserve that data, to me it means replication. It means preserving it, locating it in multiple publicly accessible repositories, not just one, so that hopefully it really can never be lost. Perhaps that's utopian. That's a nice idea, but now I want to give you the bummer idea to move back to our earlier theme. The bummer idea is very simple. Open data, to a certain extent, means you lose control of it. And when you lose control of it, I think that's a great thing. It opens up lots of possibilities for redistribution and reuse, but some of those possibilities are really creepy and are not things you would really want. So it also opens up risk, a considerable risk to a misuse of your data, as well as more productive uses of it. It's just an acknowledgement that open data is important, it's critical, we have to do it. It's not risk-free in the sense that you don't really own it anymore. It becomes anybody's, can do anything that they actually want with it, especially if they ignore any licensing requirements you put on it. So that's my last thought. Thank you.
I think we'll still be talking tenure. On a more realistic note, though, I think a big challenge, we've touched on it a little bit, is going to be demonstrating value. Is going to be figuring out what is credible and what is not. So much information is being made open and public, but how do we vet it? Okay, and I think that's going to be a key challenge coming up for the next few years. Because the reason digital humanities projects don't count for tenure is that we haven't figured out a good way to vet them yet. We don't know what quality looks like in a digital project. One model that I have seen work reasonably well is that of peer review. You bring in a credible person from a different institution who has some experience, and they tell your dean how good your work is. That works. The reason monographs work is we have figured out a value model for it. It's a scarcity model, right? MIT Press says we will only publish so many, and so if you get into that lot, you've made it. We haven't figured out what a value model, what a quality model for digital projects looks like that is not based on scarcity. And I think that's going to be a key challenge.
So we all have homework, but it's the weekend and the bar is open. So a round of applause for our wrap-up panelists, for all of our panelists. Let's keep the applause going for Adriana Link and Nathan Kinsey for making this great event. We have not thanked Todd and Jeremy, who I think have had to leave, right? Todd and Jeremy Schroenick, who have done all the tech support for here and made this go so smoothly. Thank you all so much. Please join us in the front.